The title for the conference reflects an understanding that we've got that actually the church is operating in a very different age, in what we might call a secular age, and seeking to address what we might call the missional challenge of a changing culture. And the truth is that many folk woke up to this long before the panel of Renewal and Reform, and certainly the Church of Scotland. Stanley Hurworth and William Williman in Resident Aliens say sometime between 1960 and 1980, an old, inadequately conceived world ended and a fresh new one began. We do not mean to be overly dramatic, although there are many who have not yet heard the news. This happened a long time ago. They say we've just closed our eyes to it, buried our heads in the sand, but actually this change has been around for a long time. In the past, Church, Home and State formed a national consortium that worked together to instill Christian values. A few years ago, the two of us awoke and realised that whether our parents were justified in believing this about the world and the Christian faith, nobody believed it today. Christendom had gone. And they describe waking up with that recognition that actually what they had grown up understanding was no longer the truth. That actually this consortium was no longer functioning in the way that it had functioned before. The church in a secular age. And in case you imagine that they're writing for a very different context, I went for a coffee between Christmas and New Year down to Costa, as I'm wont to do, and as I wandered down the road and sat there in Costa, picked up the newspaper, I picked up the Times in Scotland, and between Christmas and New Year they must be struggling for stories, but the front page of the Times in Scotland said this: take religion out of classroom. Thursday, December 29th, so just a few months ago. The consortium has gone. And they quote a survey. This is not just the Times saying this. They quote a YouGov poll that they'd done. 38% of adults believe that there should not be a place for worship in education. A further 17%, that's how they get their total of over 50, were saying the kids shouldn't have to be there unless they want to be there. So a huge change in our culture that's taken place, and the church is having to respond to that. We might agree with the person who wrote this, that it was much easier when apple and blackberry were just fruits, but they are no longer just fruits. We understand those in different ways. How do we respond to that? One of the things we've shared would be this, that we face a radically new challenge that requires more than minor readjustments. We need a new imagination for being church. And Alan Roxburgh, who writes in Missional Church, has been saying that for many years. But then you get the Archbishop of Canterbury trotting up to the General Assembly saying something that's not so different. In 2012, when he says, when it's difficult to maintain the inherited model, the answer lies neither in simply closing a building nor in seeking to maintain a shadow of the traditional style. Wherever you look, the voices are saying the same things. Keeping the show on the road is not enough. There has to be something more. We went round the country a number of years ago as a panel and said, what is the church's place in community and society? And we used this image of understanding where we had been and where we've travelled to. So that understanding that in Christendom the church stood in the centre of community, had that influence and respect, provided that moral compass and all the rest. But that over time the church has moved from there to the margins. One of the questions that was presented to us at that time was it the church that moved, or actually was it the community that moved and the church stayed where it was? How do we respond to that? What does it mean to be church in a secular age when everything around us has changed? One of the churches on Path of Renewal up in Inverness, Barn Church, have been looking at this, and they actually say, the community doesn't look like that any longer. The community also looks like this. It's not one mix of folk, it's actually lots of little different circles. So not only does the church find itself on the fringe, but actually that sense of community has changed altogether. And so they began to explore that question and began to say, what if the church is not actually about buildings at all, but is about people, which is what we constantly affirm, and what if this is what we're meant to do? church is actually engaged in lots of different places within our communities. And so along with many churches, the Barn are beginning to say, what does it mean to be church in a secular age? In a time when community is very diverse, what does it mean to be church in that community? Do we actually go out and set fresh expressions in all of these little circles? Or actually are we meant to gather folk together? What does it mean to be church in this changing culture? And lots of questions that are around. I'm a pragmatist by nature, and so my answer to that is just do what works. But then I went and looked at the dictionary, and the dictionary said a pragmatist is a person who's guided more by practical considerations than by ideals. And I'm thinking, well, I don't want that to be true altogether. I don't want to let go of ideals. These things are actually really important. And actually, the big question is, what do you mean by works anyway? Do you mean you've got more bums and pews on Sunday morning? Or how do you measure what church is working means? Those are huge questions. And it seems to me, a time of asking questions, a time of exploring answers together, a time when no one person has got all of the answers, a time when we need each other to explore this together. And a time, one of the things we've been very strong in saying is that one thing does not fit all. One answer does not fit all. What will work in one area of Glasgow will not work in another, will not work in Shetland or Orkney or wherever. And we need to be engaged in this together, seeking God as we move forward. But as a pragmatist, I've begun to realise that pragmatic thinking without theological underpinning does not serve us well. As someone who did a theological degree over 20 years ago, I perhaps should have recognised that a long time ago. But I have to say my theological degree I did so that I could get into ministry, not because I was dreadfully interested in theology. But I guess I've come to that place of recognising that actually that theological underpinning is crucial, so that when we are looking at what we're building, we've got some idea of what that's about, what kingdom is about, what our faith is about. And that's why I'm incredibly grateful that Stefan Paas has accepted an invitation to come and share with us today. Stefan is a theologian. I have found his stuff challenging. In many ways, it's some of what he has written that has woken me up to the importance of our theology and our ecclesiology, and it's some of that we're going to explore today. Stefan is Professor of Missiology in the Free University in Amsterdam, and we were at a conference, Liz and I, at a conference in Wittenberg last year. Stefan spoke at that conference, and we were very struck by what he said, and the lecture he's going to give just now is the one that we heard went all the way to Wittenberg to hear. So we've brought Stefan across here so that you don't have to go to Wittenberg in order to hear it. But pleased that he's with us today. Please will you welcome Stefan as he comes to share with us.
Thank you so much, Graham, and thank you for your welcome. I'm very happy to be here because the subject, a church in a secular age, is something that really concerns me for many years already. Graham told you I'm a missiologist, but I don't know what your picture is of missiology. Usually it's overseas, it's far away, it's the mission fields. My research and the courses and education I give are focused on the West. So I'm a missiologist who concentrates on the secular parts of the world. And I'm constantly asking, what does it mean to be church and to do mission there? There is a handout being handed out. So what I'm going to say is on the paper. This afternoon, I'd like to give you a lecture on what does it mean to be a local church and to do mission in a very secular environment. So the kind of place where people do not ask for God or are not particularly interested in church and faith. At least they appear not to be. This morning, I'd like to share some thoughts with you on renewal, the innovation or constant reformation. We live in 2017, 500 years ago, the Reformation started. So it seems to be a good time to think about that Protestantism, and also Reformed Protestantism, or which other variety you belong to, it has always been a movement of renewal. And I think that's a very important thing, because there's a huge challenge for the church today, in the West at least, to renew, to reinvent itself, so to speak, or maybe not reinvent itself, but to find a mode or a way of living in which it can be renewed by the Holy Spirit. Just to start with an image or a metaphor, you know what a hedgehog is, I suppose. A hedgehog, a small animal, spikes all around it to defend itself. The hedgehog is a bit like the church. It has, it's a nice animal, not very fast, a bit noisy, a bit clumsy, but it seems to get along quite well. It has developed an almost infallible defense mechanism over the years, over the centuries. And if a fox comes along, which is a much smarter animal, much stronger, the hedgehog just curls up and outweights the danger, basically. And then the fox gets bored and moves on to the next prey. Now, times are changing. Our hedgehog, let's not give him a name because this is a sad story. Our hedgehog comes across a street, because streets have entered the world, and on streets drive cars. So this animal looks in the distance, and then it sees two yellow eyes and a roaring sound, and that approaches it. And the animal does what it has always done, what has always worked. It curls up and tries to outweigh the danger, which is the worst thing that it could have done. And that may be a good metaphor for the situation of the church today, that your very best can become your very worst overnight by this hugely rapidly changing culture. So it does not say that all the old things that we've learned and that we've always done are wrong, not by far. They've always helped us, they've served us very well, and they have carried the church through the centuries. But it does mean that all these routines, these habits, structures that have helped us can very well work against us when the culture has changed so rapidly as it has now. And this is not a reason to despair, although it's a very huge challenge. I mean, our hedgehog has to learn different tricks. Now, a hedgehog is really quite a dumb animal. The church is a bit smarter, so I suppose there's more hope for the church there than for the hedgehog. Because we have very deep resources that we can draw from, and the church has proven through history that it is capable of renewing itself. And like I said, especially Protestantism has shown that. Now, what I would like to do today is take you through history on a quick walk and to show you some renewal movements within Protestantism, within the Reformation movement, and then to draw some lessons from it. So it's a part of it is historical description. I'm sorry about that, but I'm an academic, so I like those things. Just give you some facts. And then reflect on it a little bit and think of it, what it could mean for us today. So I'll try to do it in about 40 minutes so that we have some time left for Q&A. We'll see. When Luther, in 1517, 1518, a year later, was interrogated by the Cardinal Legate Cajetanus, who was sent by the Pope to question him, and explained about his new doctrine, the legate exclaimed, "This means to create a new church, what you're doing." I mean, no doubt about that. He immediately saw what would happen, and that had happened. So what you see is, usually, if a movement on the margin of a large institution, as in 1517 Luther was, on the margins of the Roman Catholic Church, developed his doctrine, when this movement splits off, becomes a new movement, as it happened in the Reformation, then this movement tends to create new margins and new radical options, which can split off or form themselves within the movement as new as renewing movements. And that's what has happened all through the century. So the Reformation itself, when it split off from the Catholic Church, has spawned all kinds of new radical and renewing movements. So new centers, new margins make it possible to entertain new radical thinking that would have been unimaginable previously. And I think it makes sense also from the perspective of innovation theory. So if you look at the Reformation history, or the history of Protestantism, through the lens of modern innovation theory, you see that two conditions must be met in order for innovation to take place. The first thing, and I discussed it a little bit yesterday when some of you were here, the first thing that's very important is distance from the center. So a renewing movement, a renewing innovating group must have some distance from the center of power. Because usually, I don't want to exaggerate, but if you look in history, 80 to 90% of the innovations in church, the really renewing movements, did not come from the center. The center is important, it gives balance, it gives structure, but it's usually not the most innovative part of the church, if I may say so. So think of all kinds of movements that were usually called sectarian, usually by their opponents, by the way, or monastic movements where people sort of specialized in radical options and explored them to the full. And they needed to withdraw from the center to an extent to make that possible. They felt that their thinking, their ideas, their practices were always threatened by mediocrity and compromise. And they needed to work out these radical options not in isolation, but with some distance from the center of power. There was less control was needed. So distance from the center. Another important condition for renewal to take place is and modern governments, for example, modern city governments. I live close to Amsterdam, and the local government of Amsterdam always promotes this kind of thinking among artists, entrepreneurs, and so on. Hybridity or unexpected encounters. So you need a good mix of people, different people, for innovation to take place. There can be a multicultural community. For example, I know some churches in the Netherlands, and probably there are churches here as well, that have become multicultural and explore multicultural ways of leadership. Churches that consist of, let's say, Dutch people, some people from other parts of Europe, some people from Africa. And usually these people have very different cultural ideas of what it means to lead a group, as you can imagine. The Dutch are very democratic. They like to work in teams. The Africans usually less so. And they try to work out together how to lead a church, which is a very interesting thing, but also creates new theology, new ideas of what it means to represent God, to represent Christ in the church, what it means for the offices. Because we always underestimate how our ideas of church leadership, for example, have been influenced by our culture or by our specific history. So hybridity. What it means is you need different people who share certain values but are very different to explore new questions. We all know, of course, if you want to learn, if you want to discover new things, you should not surround yourself with people who are just like you. You need different people. People who challenge you, people with different characters, different theologies to an extent, different life histories. That's the way to learn and to find new questions. Innovation, renewal, needs that because innovation, renewal, is more than just adaptation. You know what it means to adapt things. If you're a pastor, for example, and you're wondering how can we get more teenagers in church, could we adapt some things in the church service, for example, in the worship service, to attract them? Well, usually not, but you could try. But that's adaptation. That's changing something in the existing model without changing too much. An innovation question would be, is a worship service on Sunday morning the way to attract teenagers at all? So that's a very different kind of question. Not how can we adapt or change things in the existing structures or models, but how can are these models or structures working at all? And usually, again, you need to step out of your comfort zone and work together with very different people to explore those questions. Now, the Reformation created possibilities for churches to do that, because they had distance from the center, especially in the first century. The Reformation consisted of all kinds of churches that were spread out in diaspora all over Europe without a clear center. And of course they had split off from Rome, so that center was not there anymore. And also unexpected encounters, because all these refugee communities in Geneva, in London, in Emden in Germany, they had all kinds of different people from all over Europe. Class differences were taken away. People shared some values, but were very different. And that was a period of strong renewal. But like I said, every radical option, every new movement also creates its own radical options. And let me just mention two of them from the Reformation and beyond. The Anabaptists in the 16th century and the Methodists in the 18th century. So one movement from the continent and one movement from this island. The Anabaptists originated in the very early 16th century, were strongly influenced by Luther, but split off from his movement because they thought Luther was not radical enough, or not consistent enough in his Reformation. They wanted a radical return to the New Testament, strongly restorationist. And for example, one of the criticisms was that the reformers, Luther and later on Calvin and others, retained infant baptism. They couldn't find it in the New Testament. And they couldn't find the whole idea of baptizing whole populations in the New Testament. They saw always a connection with faith, personal faith. So, and this in turn would lead, at least according to the Anabaptists, to a lack of holiness. So, they were merely baptized pagans, they would say. If you just sprinkle children with water and then leave them untouched, do not do anything about discipling and so on. So European populations were considered Christian within Christendom, in the Christendom system, without being really Christian. That was their perspective. From their perspective, as they called them, the false prophets of the mainstream Reformation had only put a new superficial religious layer on an essentially unchanged pagan population. And infant baptism, which was, according to them, a pseudo-Christian ritual, seduced people to see their nominal Christianity as the real thing. For them, the world of Christendom was a real mission field. It's interesting to see that the Anabaptists in the 16th century were the first Christian movement since maybe 1,000 years in Europe who used the word mission again. Mission was over, according to the mainline reformers. It was an apostolic thing. In the time of the apostles they did that, but we don't do that anymore. The Anabaptists were the first to entertain mission again, and evangelism. And who said that the Great Commission, Matthew 28, verse 19 and 20, was just as valid as ever. Because the majority of the populations in Germany and Switzerland, where they lived, and the Netherlands, were, according to them, a godless generation, a confused Babylon. I'm just quoting from some sources, and interesting terms, aren't they? An absolute requirement for church membership for them was a personal, conscious confession of belief, followed by adult baptism or believer's baptism and commitment to a holy life. And members of the true church should subject themselves to rigorous discipline, since, and I quote, nobody will truly acknowledge Christ if he does not follow him with his life, as Hans Denk, one of the early Anabaptists, said. So active searching for holiness was the characteristic of a true Christian. Now, I'm not sure what you think about this or what you think about all this terminology, but the point is, these people entertained subjects and dared to ask questions, actually with great personal consequences, that were not asked for a long time, and were not, at least not in the same way. Also, they restored eschatology, so the lively expectation of Christ's second coming. Until deep in the 1560s, the early Anabaptists had this expectation. They were convinced that they lived in the very last days of the world, and that the churches that they planted, were, well, a sort of Noah's Ark. They had to invite people in to be saved from the coming judgment. And all other churches had failed, so here we are. And that belief, you could imagine, gave great urgency to their missionary attempts. They went at great lengths to gather God's harvest within the true church so as to save their neighbors from the approaching judgment. I think all this sounds probably very sectarian for some of you, but the interesting thing is that it may have been not so bad as it seems, because they were also very evangelistic. So their views of the population around them, those who did not follow the Anabaptist beliefs, was not that this was a lost generation or something like that, the outer darkness or whatever. No, they were people who could be saved. Many outsiders could become insiders. Or as one of the Anabaptist leaders put it, he said, outside the true church there are many good-hearted people who have a desire for the truth. And in the end, the purpose of missionary activity would be that all the people would become members of this true church, and they believed that it could happen. So I would say their strong evangelistic zeal helped them to not see themselves as a sort of holy remnant against the rest of mankind, but as a holy seed of a new humanity, living in eager expectation of the multitudes that would be drawn in. But the other side of the spectrum is, as soon as this missionary zeal declined, and that happened towards the end of the 16th century, their remaining convictions could, of course, easily lead to a more sectarian position, in the narrow sense of the word. And that also happened. But it is what it is. It is a historical movement with different sides to it. I'm just exploring it because they asked new questions. They offered new perspectives. Their emphasis on personal faith in combination with a strong, view of the church and eschatology led them to launch a vigorous evangelistic church planting movement and evangelism. Usually a wandering preacher, they called them apostles, also interesting. They were the first to use the word apostle again. So they reinvented the offices in the church. When such a wandering preacher, an apostle, who crossed parish boundaries, which was a deadly sin in those days, traveling ministry, wandering ministry, they came to a new location, they tried to contact some followers of the movement, and then they organized a meeting, usually just in one night. They baptized a few people, they had Holy Communion, and then a new church was planted. And sometimes the entire process from evangelism to church planting took only one night. And once the church was planted, the apostle traveled further and local leadership would take over. And I think it's easy to conceive how a simple method like this one, applied in a receptive environment, could result in hundreds of small churches all over Europe within a few years. And there are examples of Anabaptist preachers who baptized over 10,000 people in their career, which is on the average about one per day, over 30 years, every day. Of course, they were heavily persecuted, so many of these Anabaptist preachers had a career of only a few months before they were exiled or killed. But anyway, some of them escaped persecution and could baptize thousands of people. Now, that's the Anabaptists. I'll reflect on it a little bit more later on, but let's first go to the Methodists in the 18th century. A very different movement, later and more modern also. They talk about 18th century. So a democratic spirit has begun in Europe, more individualization, more emphasis on the experience of faith, that real Christianity is something that you should do by heart, not just by thinking. All these things happened. They were heavily influenced also by German pietism. For example, Count Zinzendorf from the Herrnhut community, a very interesting guy, by the way, who also gave the lie to the idea that all these movements were anti-intellectual. They were not. Zinzendorf and also Wesley later on were all but anti-intellectual. They were great theologians as well. And like I said yesterday, if you want to do theology in an interesting, creative way, do start such a movement, because you're always constantly learning on the job and experimenting and reflecting on what's happening today and what God does today, which is a very good input for good theology. Zinzendorf, for example, resisted dead fundamentalism. He didn't use the word because that didn't exist by then, but dead orthodoxy that could not see any problem with the Bible, used the Bible as a sort of recipe book, cookbook, and also against liberalism, a word that didn't exist either, but that used the Bible to satisfy intellectual needs. Now, he said the Bible contains errors, obviously, but the Bible is not written to satisfy our intellectual needs or our needs for debate or discussion, but to create a bond with Christ. We should read through the Bible and find the blood and wounds of Christ, as he said in his German pietist way. A very interesting guy. Same goes for Wesley in the 18th century Methodism. A great theologian with missional experience. He was sent to the American mission field in 1735. He considered himself as a good churchman. He was a high churchman, actually. He found it very important to have the ancient rites being established, also among the Native Americans and what he would call the Indians in America. Didn't work very well. They were not very high church oriented there. But it also brought him into a sort of crisis of faith, as what many missional-minded people, I think, can relate to. If you give the best that you have and people just don't listen, are not interested, that can do all kinds of things with you. So he reflected again on, who am I? What do I really believe? And when he was on the ship to America, they came in a storm, and he met some Moravian brethren, let's say pietist people from the eastern part of Europe, and he saw their utter calm in the storm, their assuredness of faith. And that struck him. And on his return to England in 1738, and after further conversations with these Moravian Christians, he underwent a conversion experience in which he felt his heart strangely warmed, as he put it down in his diaries. He always remained plagued by self-doubt, but this experience provided the energy John Wesley needed to join the revivalist preachers who were drawing such immense crowds in England and America by then. Now, Wesley made it clear, and I think that's important to see, that his movement was always meant as a renewal movement within the church. He did not plan to plant a new church. That's actually is true for many of these renewal movements in history. Often they split off more or less accidentally, but usually they did not start with the idea to do that. Often they were pushed out as well. His image was of groups of disciplined lay Christians within the parish structure of the church being ministered to by ordained Anglican clergy for purposes of the sacramental ministries. So he especially did not organize his societies on Sunday morning, for example, because he wanted people to go to church and to have communion there. And then after church, they came together for mission purposes, strengthening each other in the faith, praying, and so on. Another part of his mission was related to his practice of appointing lay preachers. So there is a democratic spirit in this. Non-ordained lay preachers, and installing an itinerant apostolic ministry without much regard for parish boundaries. Interesting, maybe for those who are historically interested, many historians have suggested that the wandering preachers of John Wesley were part of a sort of recurring pattern of apostolic ministries in Christianity. The mission has always used two structures, the parish and the monastery. Those who remain on one place and those who wander around, the apostles and the preachers, and so on. And I think we need that today as well, by the way. But his highly mobile soldiers of Christ adopted a wide range of missionary strategies. Open-air preaching, ritual and drama, love feasts, watch night services, processions, camp meetings, Sunday schools, and also they cooperated with local clergy wherever that was possible. He wanted to revitalize the church rather than replace it. And if a preacher had some success, he could start a local society of believers. It could be small or large. It was organized in circuits and sort of networks of different congregations over a large territory. And Wesley traveled around this national circuit and expected his preachers to do the same on a regional level. It was also clever organization, by the way, because the flexibility of this system made it possible for Methodism to grow rapidly, because local groups were largely self-multiplying. And the continual turnover of itinerants, of wandering preachers, meant that weaker preachers could be tolerated more easily. Because, well, if he couldn't preach, you had him only for 1 week, so then he moved on, and then the next one came. So that helped. They could keep finding him a nice person. So societies were not hampered in their growth by poor leadership. And for Wesley himself, let's say, thinking top-down, from the standpoint of bureaucracy or organization, it meant that his preachers were prevented from building up a personal following. So if a preacher would leave or start his own church, and sometimes that happened, this would usually not result in a huge loss of members, because they didn't have the time and the opportunity to build up a great crowd of followers. So in short, the entire structure of societies, circuits and itinerants was a skillful combination of bottom-up vitality and top-down discipline. Now, just 2 historical case studies. Let me just do some wrapping up and some reflections for today. Maybe first we should see, I think, that the DNA of all these movements is rather similar. Of course, they express them differently, and if you look today, for example, to the Pentecostals or other renewal movements, you constantly see the same recurring patterns. I've defined 5 of them, and they're on your handout. First, it almost always starts with spiritual experience, theology, a return to what it is actually about, our Christianity. It's a very important thing, and I think also for today, if you, as the Church of Scotland and other churches here in Scotland, think about what is our response to secularization, there is a great risk in trying to be as relevant as possible, trying to find connections, trying to do all kinds of intellectual exercises in analyzing culture and finding good, rationally solid, supported answers. But usually what we see in history is not that. It's Christians rediscovering Christianity. And of course that is triggered somehow by external influences to an extent, but it's very important to see that if you don't, you need an answer to the question, let me just put it very simple, what is the gospel for Scotland? What is important in our faith for this particular nation? And what you see in all these movements is that they started with an experience of New Testament reality. They returned to Jesus Christ and the apostles. And you could call that restorationism or primitivism. There are all kinds of names for that. But it's more than just intellectually finding out what the New Testament actually says. It's more than that. It's basically seeing the New Testament as a storehouse of experience, as the place where the Spirit is most accessible, so to speak. So it's not just talking about the New Testament, but also restoring New Testament practice to an extent. Small communities, baptism in some ways, the gifts of the Spirit. You can find many of those discoveries in history. And I think it's very important for you as churches to think about that. What is our discovery today in the New Testament, in the Bible? It was to return to the New Testament was to enter life in God's presence, and therefore it was crucial to reintroduce the pre-institutional patterns of church life, to install New Testament standards of ethical behavior, to accept and obey the New Testament practice of baptism, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that you should do all this. My point is, you should make your own discoveries. You should find out what it is for you today, here in Scotland. It was an adventure of every new discoveries, a spiritual renewal. It gave access to exactly those experiences that were needed to equip the people of God anew and engage the world. These movements strongly believed that only a New Testament kind of Christianity would be able to address the great crisis in church and society. So again, it never begins with clever analysis, ways to get rational grip of the situation, control. It always begins with some sort of revival, revisioning Christianity. Then there's always a sense, of course, of relevance also. So we've discovered what is important, but why is it relevant for this particular culture? There's always a sense of societal crisis in these movements, a sort of idea, a diagnosis of society. What is wrong with our world? What is wrong with our society? Why do people need the gospel? That's a very simple question again. I once spoke to an American pastor, he was a Lutheran pastor, and he said, Stefan, what I always ask when I do training, and I just repeat him now, I always ask 3 questions to pastors. He said, every pastor should be able to give an answer to these 3 questions. The first is, it's very simple, but it makes sense, doesn't it? Why do people need Jesus? Do you have an answer to that? And he said, he's an American, he's a pragmatist, just as Graham. He said, I don't care what your answer is, but you should be able to answer it. Why do people need Jesus? Your second question, why do people need the church? And the third, why do people need my church? They're not all equally important, but he said that helps you get to start thinking about these things. Just try to answer this. The answers can be complex and long and high church-like. They can be very simple and so on. That's not the point. If you are just stupefied by these questions, if you don't have any answer, then you have a problem. So, all these movements had answers to those questions. They had a sense of urgency. They were vital. They had energy. And they were prepared to suffer great costs, often their lives. Obviously, they were provoked by what they considered as the insufficient reformation of the church. But usually it was combined with a vision of a moral or restored society. And this morality was often expressed in very narrow terms, often sexually, or alcohol abuse, but also greater visions of new community formation, equality between men and women, the acceptance of refugees or whatever. What does it mean to be a true human community? And do we see that in our societies? What can the church contribute to that? What does it mean to, how can the gospel answer to those questions? Empowerment of the laity, the question, who should do it? And what you see in all these renewal movements is they're almost always bottom-up, almost always inspired by a democratic spirit. Miroslav Volf, who studied these movements, I quote him, he says, the prime emphasis of this dissenting Christian movements in Europe was the empowerment of the ordinary Christian. The structures, he says, of the particular ecclesial power would have to be changed, in which 2 or 3 faithful people remain powerless against the powerful hierarchy. So in all these movements was a strong awareness that in order to meet the particular challenge of their age, the true people of God, men and women, that's what you always see, especially in the first generations, women are just as important in those movements as the men are. Later on, unfortunately, this often changes. They should be mobilized and be gathered in communities, in congregations or in societies, and that was important to happen. Disciplined communities, living the life, walking the walk, inspired by this great rediscovery of what the gospel is about, answering to their societies. So the missionary zeal comes forth from that. A great commitment to evangelism, to serving society, social action. Often you see holistic ideas there. One of the problems of the church today is that, especially in the 1970s and 60s, social action and evangelism have become separated. Yeah, the liberals do social action, the evangelicals do evangelism. I'm summarizing it very briefly, but basically that's the idea. And the liberals and evangelicals were always agreed on one thing, that social action and evangelism do not have to do anything with each other. I mean, they're unrelated, which is a sad and tragic thing, I think. And I don't know about Scotland, but in the Netherlands I see that changing, fortunately. So the new generations are trying to do both. They're not ashamed of the name of Jesus, and they're not reluctant to do social action, even if it's not always possible to name the name of Jesus. I mean, beyond these deep rifts, ruptures in the church, and I think that's very good to see. And what you always see in these missionary movements is that they're not bothered too much with what is prior, what comes first, what's more important. They just do it. And they tell why they do it. Now, let me see how much time we have left. Okay. Innovation. All these movements were great in innovation. It's hard to imagine how many of the things that we find quite normal today, even in mainstream churches, have been not very normal in history, have been invented somewhere, sometime. The leading figures of these movements belong to what we would call the creative minorities of their age. Not always easy people to work with. Sometimes very difficult people. Sometimes a little bit sectarian. It's always good if you are someone in the center yourself, in the balance of power, in the center of power yourself, that those people that irritate you the most could be the people that the church needs in the future. You need to find a way to work with them on a distance. Try not to irritate each other too much, but find a place for those people where they can really do what they're good at. Not everyone who is, I'm not turning it around. Some people are just irritating. But you get the point. So these people are highly entrepreneurial, full of initiative, often in possession of great managerial skills. And I think these dissenting movements of European Christianity have enriched the church in many ways. Theologically, they have widened the imagination by radicalizing church and world distinctions. They engage the sectarian option. In other words, to put it simply, they refused to accept that Europe was Christian. They underlined the missionary nature of the church long before any mainline church would do so. And they emphasized the priesthood of all believers. Or, as some African churches today say, the evangelisthood of all believers. I find that a nice word. Harvey Kriani from Malawi says that. In terms of practice, they have reintroduced itinerancy, wandering ministry, apostolic ministry, as a way of doing things. They organized the people of God for action through small groups and societies, and they promoted, let's say, primitive congregational practices like singing, prayer meetings, the love meal, other supposedly New Testament rituals. All these things we find so common. They were not common for a long time. All right, so some things to conclude this, some thoughts from missiology. Let's just get this straight. The first thing I think we should recognize is that the missional nature of the church was found in the margins of European Christianity. Like I said, around the middle of the 20th century, you see that every mainline church, every leading theologian in Europe is beginning to say, yes, Europe has become a mission field. The church is missionary by its very nature. Think of the Second Vatican Council, who said that. That's in the 50s and 60s, everyone agrees on that. But they didn't around 1900 or in 1800. Then it was the marginal movements who said that. It has become a truism that mission happens in 6 continents, that the distinction between mission bases and mission fields is no longer tenable. And I think these are new developments that could not be surmised by the large majority of European Christianity before the 20th century. So in my opinion, the role of these first Protestant separatist movements in Europe has been crucial in preparing this new theological vision. They were ready to give their freedom and their lives for the evangelization of their own continent. And in this way, they made mission a matter of confession rather than just something that the church does apart from other things. It belonged to the identity of the church. And they did this mainly by undermining the traditional concept of a Christian nation. And most of the separatist movements in Europe, they opted for a gathered church, as they call it, consisting of committed Christians and dedicating themselves to a life of discipleship. You could give some comments to that, and I'll do that this afternoon, but for now, I'll just let it stand. In other words, they were the first for a long time who conceptualized the church as a community, not just as an institution or as a building, but as a community within or even in opposition to the wider society. And this made it possible to see Europe as a mission field, like any other place where the pilgrim church lives a precarious life amidst unbelievers, inviting them to respond to the gospel. Most leading European theologians would not arrive at this position before the Second World War. And also in another way, the early Protestant church planters were pioneers of a missionary ecclesiology. The mobilization of ordinary Christians put mission back into the heart of the congregation. It was not just something for specialists, for professionals, for people you send out to faraway countries. In the 1840s, Johann Gerhard Unken, a Baptist apostle of Germany, said famously that every Baptist is a missionary, and every apostolic Christian church must be a mission society. That's, as far as I know, I've studied this history, this is the very first time that a European theologian says things like this. I was a Baptist, not one from my Reformed church. So today, we have become used to the claim of the essential missionary nature of the local congregation, but we must keep remembering that this claim is a delayed formal recognition of grassroots insights that had lived in Europe for a long time already. And these insights have been kept alive primarily in these fringe movements of European Christianity. And that's always something to keep in mind when you meet fringe movements today, irritating people today. There's people that always want to go further. There's also an ecumenical challenge in that, because history advances. We're not living in Christendom anymore. And that does not just mean something for mainline churches, large churches. It also means something for the churches that have their history in these fringe movements, the free churches, the independent churches. Because the whole difference between established and free, or between voluntary and nominal, predicates on a society in which Christianity was by and large the ruling narrative, Christendom. But this society is history, or is becoming history. In my country it's history. I'm not sure about Scotland, but I suppose it's basically the same. So even in countries with a strong folk church tradition or national church tradition, new challenges emerge. No longer is mission a matter of reaching out to nominal Christians or baptized pagans, as they would call them. But increasingly, the difference between nominal and voluntary Christianity does not make sense anymore. All churches are free churches now. All churches are voluntary churches. The revival model has collapsed. We're in search of true mission now. There's nothing to revive anymore among large majorities of the population. We need to do mission, pioneer mission. So that's one important reason why it's important to work together, to leave the old trenches of free versus mainline, nominal versus etc. That is something we should leave behind us. We need to work together, really. Also because different churches, different church traditions maintain different views of secular reality. We say we live in a secular age, but what do we mean with that? And it's interesting to see that different Christians have different views of that. So as far as I can see, the traditional free churches, let's say Baptist, Anabaptist, Brethren, and so on, they especially emphasize the post-Christendom aspect of secularization. So the institutional collapse of Christianity, the separation of culture and Christianity. But what I often hear in those circles is that essentially nothing has changed. People are just as eager for the gospel, but now we have a free market. People can choose for themselves. Churches must be entrepreneurial. They must compete for customers. Think of the church growth theory. I'll discuss that a little bit more this afternoon. And that makes a lot of sense. Today, religion is to an extent consumption. It's choice. We all have chosen for what we do. We had a choice, at least. But I think they often tend to forget another insight, and I would say that is kept more faithfully by the former established churches, namely that the post-Christian element of our societies, the lack of Christian formation, the anti-religious criticism, the implausibility of faith for many Europeans, maybe including for some of us ourselves. Like I said yesterday, some of us may have enough faith for themselves, but find it very hard to share it with others. And then there's the postmodern take, which emphasizes the sub-rational dimension of our choices, the importance of liturgy, ritual, the sacramental aspects of life. And I believe we need all of this in our mission today. And that's why an ecumenical approach is so important. Mission has to go together with unity. Maybe different forms of unity than we had, but we need to find each other. It would be destructive for our mission today if Christians kept operating along the old lines of established versus free or nominal versus choice. Excuse me, my alarm clock disturbs me. But I'm done, by and large. So what we see is a new constellation emerge. As, for example, hybrid congregations, mergers between different church traditions, multicultural churches, cooperation between Roman Catholics and evangelicals in southern European countries. I know a few examples. Or ancient mainline Protestant churches embarking on church planting. Fresh expression. In Germany we see Gemeindegründung, Pioniersprojekten in the Netherlands. We see that all. That's interesting, and I think ecumenically very important. Let me end with a quote by Philip Jenkins, I think a quite well-known researcher of religion, and especially religion from the global south. He says, Europe, in all its secularization, may be a laboratory for new forms of faith, new structures of organization and interaction that can accommodate to a dominant secular environment. And in this, Europe can also mean something, perhaps, for the global church. I'm done. Thank you.